as some of you are aware, I'm looking for PhD funding at the moment, so I've put this presentation together just to showcase some of my ideas. The proposed title of my doctoral research is Reinforcing Stereotypes, Social Media, Identities and Sex Offender Reintegration. The aim of the presentation is just to take you through some background literature in relation to this project, some of the key research questions and proposed methods, a few issues around access to participants and ethics, and then a brief timeline of how I intend to complete the project. Now, as alluded to on the title slide, my project looks at the interactions between social media use, public attitudes and knowledge about sexual offending, and the reintegration of people with sexual convictions upon their release from custody. My title also mentioned identities, which I think is an important issue to consider in relation to both the public and those with convictions. At first glance, it does appear that punitive news reporting of crime, particularly sexual crime, serves an important purpose in that, from a psychological perspective, the reporting acts almost as a Freudian-style defence mechanism, if we can adopt the phrase from psychology, aimed at providing clear delineations between the good and the bad, or between offenders and the law-abiding majority. Furthermore, the identities of those released from custody have been implicated as being important in the process of desistance from crime. Now, Hal Foster, back in 1996, coined the phrase the pathological public sphere. And he said that we are, if I can just offer a brief quote, overrun by voyeurs and exhibitionists. I think this is a particularly good way of viewing the increase in social media use that we've seen over the last few years, as people are now able to witness and become involved in sleaze and scandal, as we've seen through the Ryan Giggs gagging case a couple of years ago, and in the naming of alleged paedophiles over the last 12 months. A paper by Willis, Levinson and Ward back in 2010 describes how increasingly punitive public attitudes towards the sex offender population may actually be a hindrance to long-term desistance from crime. They draw on a range of criminological theory to make this case, and they argue that negative public attitudes lead to a lack of opportunities for community reintegration, which in turn makes reoffending increasingly likely. And finally, at the bottom, Shabmaruna's 2001 book, Making Good, describes how ex-offenders tend to adopt one of two identities upon their release from prison. These can broadly be categorised as redemption or condemnation identities. The former will generally strive to make amends for their crimes, whereas the latter feel persecuted within the community, feeling as though they are not able of controlling their own fate. This condemnation identity is associated with increased rates of reconviction. So my project takes the form of three separate yet interrelated strands. Firstly, I'll analyse the content of social media reports in relation to the information that they convey about sexual offending rates, offence characteristics, for example, things such as the offender-victim relationship, the age of offenders and victims, and similar things like that. Next, I'll evaluate this content in relation to its cognitive impact. So by this, I mean the impact that social media content has on consumers in relation to their attitudes and knowledge about sexual offending. And in light of the growing public hostility towards those with convictions for sexual offences, I think it's also important to investigate the impact of public attitudes on the identities of people within this offending group. I also intend to look at the reintegration processes of these individuals and to map their sense of identity against the extent to which they've been able to reintegrate back into their communities upon release from prison. And this is a proposed cycle that my eventual thesis might follow from the actual content of social media reports impacting potentially upon public attitudes, which in turn may have some effect on ex-offender identities and subsequent reintegration and desistance from crime. I think this flowchart is important to show as it sums up how the three elements of the project are related. So the first part of the project is a thematic content analysis of media stories about sexual offending that are shared through the Twitter feeds of all British national newspapers and BBC News. This aims to answer the question on the slide here about the representativeness of media reports about sexual offending. Now, for inclusion in this stage of the study, a report must refer to sexual offending either in a general or specific sense. So, for example, a story will be included whether it's about national sex offender policy, or about a specific case of sexual offending that has occurred. Then a systematic sample of tweets replying to the links will also be thematically analysed, as will the 5 best and worst rated comments left on the news organisation's website, so the comment section below the story. This will reveal what sort of messages are being taken home by readers. And then the second part of the study will essentially be a survey of members of the public in order to establish the extent to which engagement with social media influences attitudes and knowledge about sexual offending. The survey method used will aim to examine how closely social media users' knowledge is correlated to the content of reports and messages shared by social media websites. It will also look at the differences between social media users and non-users in terms of their attitude and knowledge about sexual offending. 2 surveys will be used as part of this project. The Attitude Towards Sex Offenders Scale, which was created by Todd Hogan in 1993, and a questionnaire that will be designed to examine respondents' knowledge about sex offending statistics. The ATS is a 36-item questionnaire, self-report, and it adopts a Likert scale type layout, and it asks questions about the relative riskiness and suitability for community reintegration of sex offenders. Scores range from 0 to 144, with high scores indicating positive attitudes, and psychometric properties of the scale are very good, with Cronbach alpha reliability ratings being consistently between 0.8 and 0.9. The second questionnaire will be designed specifically for the purposes of this project and will question respondents on issues relating to similar themes as I've mentioned before: offender-victim relationships, reoffending rates, and sentencing policy. Now, in light of the growing public hostility towards sex offender population, I think it's important to establish how public opinion affects the identities and reintegration processes of this group. I'll be looking to examine whether this group of people do feel the effects of media stereotyping, and if they do, whether this impacts on their identity and narrative script. So whether or not stereotyping influences whether someone adopts a redemption or a condemnation identity, as I've mentioned earlier, in relation to the Shad Maruna work. In addition to this, I want to look at how the sex offender label impacts upon the reintegration processes of these individuals. And this part of the project will look at the extent to which those with sexual convictions have been able to live their lives in the community for all intents and purposes in a normal way. So specifically in relation to the various turning points described by Sampson and Laub over from the USA. For this section of the project, I'll be using semi-structured interviews, analysed using the interpretative phenomenological analysis technique, and they'll be with people with convictions for sexual offences who are now based in the community. In terms of numbers, I think it's that around 20 interviews will be sufficient to gain a deep enough understanding to tell the stories of these individuals, and I'm hoping to recruit people who have been based in the community now for varying periods of time. This will help me to gain a longitudinal understanding of the reintegration processes of these individuals. And as part of the interviews, I'll look at investigating themes relating to post-custody housing, occupational issues, and the interviewee's ability to enter into and maintain close personal relationships. These themes are commonly referred to within dissidence literature and map closely to some of the factors that are outlined by Sampson and Laub. Now, any potential funders will be interested in some of the potential hurdles that I'll need to overcome, and I think that one of the main ones to consider is access to participants and ethics. In terms of recruiting people with sexual convictions, I've already been in contact with 2 organisations that you can see on the screen here. So Circles UK and the Lucy Faithfull Foundation. They have both sounded very positive about the proposal, but they are unable to make any concrete assurances of support until funding decisions are made. Participants for the survey part of the project will be recruited through direct communication and invitations being sent via social media, and non-users will be recruited through an email and poster advertising campaign and word of mouth. Now, the project will fully adhere to the British Society of Criminology's Code of Ethics and any host university's ethical guidelines throughout, and fully informed consent and comprehensive debriefing will be particularly important in relation to the project. Respondents to the attitude and knowledge So they will be provided with links to helplines and groups that they can contact if they need help, having been affected by any of the issues that they've been asked to consider. And of course, participants will be able to withdraw their participation at any time whilst they are completing the survey. The interviews that I carry out will be audio taped and fully transcribed. When they've been transcribed, tapes will be destroyed and the transcriptions will be kept in a secure locked cabinet in line with the Data Protection Act. All participants will be assured that they will not be personally identifiable in any publications that arise from the project, and only those involved in the project will have access to their information and responses. You can see here a brief timeline of how I propose the project is carried out, through from a literature review to developing interview schedules, writing up and devising follow-up research studies for postdoctoral research. And thank you very much. I hope that's been useful.